A London fog. The rain had been falling in sheets for hours. It was one of those relentless downpours that washed the city clean, or at least tried to. But the streets of London always held on to their grime, their history. Isabel watched from the large bay window of her modest flat in Notting Hill, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, its warmth, offering a moment of comfort, though her thoughts were far from peaceful. She had moved to London a decade ago, seeking the vibrancy of the city, the possibility of something more than the quiet, predictable life. She had grown up within the countryside. At first, it was exhilarating, new faces, new places, and the endless possibility of adventure. She had fallen in love with the city almost instantly. Then, she had fallen in love with Dominic. Dominic was everything. She had imagined in her dreams of a city man. Tall, confident, with that charming mixture of intellect and casual arrogance that made him seem untouchable. They met at a gallery opening in Shoreditch. He, a rising star in the architecture world. She, still finding her footing in the publishing world. Their chemistry was instant, but nothing about Dominic was easy. He was elusive. Their relationship had always been like trying to hold on to smoke, a mix of passionate nights and distant days. He would disappear for work trips, and when he returned, his eyes seemed to carry the weight of things left unsaid. Isabel would always wonder if it was just the weight of his job, or if there was something more, something darker lingering behind his charming smiles and quick wit. Tonight was different, though. She hadn't seen Dominic in nearly 2 weeks. He had been distant, more so than usual. The last message he sent was a short, cryptic text. "We'll talk soon." That had been 3 days ago. A knock on her door broke her reverie. It wasn't the casual tap of a neighbor, nor was it the soft, predictable sound Dominic would make with his knuckles when he came over. This was firmer, more deliberate. Isabel stood, setting her tea down on the small side table. She hesitated for a moment, her hand on the brass doorknob. A wave of unease swept over her, but she shook it off and opened the door. There stood a man she had never seen before, older, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that had clearly seen better days. He was soaked from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his eyes, sharp and serious, seemed unaffected by the weather. "Isabel Thompson?" His voice was calm, but there was something unnerving about the way he said her name. "Yes? Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight. "I'm here on behalf of Dominic Price." Her heart skipped. Dominic, he had sent this man? Panic gripped her for a moment, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Is Dominic all right?" she asked, stepping back slightly as if to let the man inside. He didn't move, only watching her with that same unsettling intensity. "I'm afraid Mr. Price is unavailable at the moment," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "There are some matters that require your immediate attention." Isabel frowned. "Unavailable? What does that mean? Is he in trouble? I don't understand." The man took a step forward, still standing on the threshold, but now closer, so close that she could smell the faint scent of rain and leather. "Dominic's business dealings. I'm sure you're aware of some of them. Perhaps not all." Isabel's mind raced. Business? Dominic had never talked much about his work, but she assumed it was just his way of keeping his personal and professional lives separate. But this man, what was he implying? "I really don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her eyes darting around the hallway, searching for some kind of explanation. "Mr. Price has been involved in some complicated financial dealings. Unfortunately, he's in over his head. And now, those who are owed something have turned their attention to you." Isabel felt a chill creep up her spine. "Me? I don't have anything to do with Dominic's work." The man shrugged, the movement almost casual, but his eyes never left hers. "That may be true, but Dominic has used certain assets, your name, among others, to secure investments. There are consequences, Miss Thompson." The room seemed to spin for a moment. She felt lightheaded, like the floor had dropped beneath her. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man gave her a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm saying, Isabel, that you have a choice. You can either help us recover what we're owed, or things will become very difficult for you." "I don't understand," she began, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "You don't need to understand. You just need to cooperate." With that, he turned on his heel and walked down the narrow hallway, disappearing into the fog of the rainy night. Isabel stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, as the reality of the situation slowly sunk in. Dominic had left her tangled in a web of deceit, and now she was on the hook for it. The next few days passed in a blur. She couldn't get Dominic on the phone, and the man from that night never returned. But the sense of dread grew with each passing hour, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Then, one evening, as she sat alone in her flat, her phone buzzed. A text. It was Dominic. "Meet me at the bridge. 10 p.m. The bridge. The place where they had shared countless moments, their secret spot overlooking the Thames. She grabbed her coat and rushed out into the rain, her mind racing with questions. As she approached the bridge, she saw him, Dominic, standing there in the dim light, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sunken, his clothes disheveled. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. "Dominic," she breathed, walking towards him. "What the hell is going on?" He didn't speak at first, just stared out at the water, his hands gripping the railing tightly. When he finally turned to face her, there was a look of desperation in his eyes that she had never seen before. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said quietly. "I thought I could fix it. But now it's too late. What did you do?" Isabel demanded, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," was all he said. And then, without another word, he stepped up onto the railing and jumped. For a moment, Isabel stood frozen in shock, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She rushed to the edge, her heart pounding in her chest. But Dominic was gone, swallowed by the dark, churning waters of the Thames. The fog closed in around her, thick and suffocating. And in that moment, she realized that the man she had loved was nothing more than a ghost, an illusion she had clung to, but one that had ultimately disappeared into the shadows of London. Isabel stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the dark waters below. Her brain refused to make sense of what had just happened. Dominic, gone in an instant. It was as if the city itself had swallowed him, the Thames pulling him into its murky depths. For several long minutes, she did nothing but tremble, her hands clutching the cold, wet railing of the bridge. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had worsened, pelting her like icy needles. She could barely breathe. Her thoughts were wild, racing from one disconnected idea to another. Dominic's smile, the man's ominous words, the text message, and the feeling that she had never truly known the person she had loved. But what had just happened wasn't a nightmare. It was real. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from the haze. She reached for it with numb fingers, hands trembling uncontrollably. The name on the screen sent her heart plunging into her stomach. "Unknown number. Walk away. You've seen nothing." The message was as cold and distant as the night, and yet it hit her like a bullet. She wanted to scream. She wanted to call someone, anyone. But her body remained frozen, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. Her instincts screamed for her to leave. Run. Hide. She fumbled to tuck her phone away and took a step back from the railing. Her legs felt unsteady, her knees weak. She looked up and down the bridge, half expecting to see the man from before lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. But she was alone, just the rain and the soft hum of the city beyond. Isabel turned and walked, nearly stumbling over her own feet as she hurried down the street, the lights of passing cars a blur around her. She didn't stop until she reached her flat, the front door slamming behind her as she collapsed against it, gasping for breath. The flat was quiet, eerily so, and the silence felt suffocating after the chaos of the bridge. She peeled off her drenched coat and dropped it on the floor, not caring about the mess. Her thoughts kept looping, images of Dominic and the message on her phone flashing in her mind. She should call the police. Dominic had jumped into the Thames. He was gone, and yet, as soon as she reached for her phone, she hesitated. The message, "Walk away. You've seen nothing." If she reported what had happened, would that man come for her? Would whoever Dominic had been mixed up with find her? The cold realization hit her. She was already caught in something much larger than she could understand. If she called the police, what would she even say? That Dominic had drowned himself because of some shadowy business deal? She didn't know enough. She had no answers, only questions. And she was terrified of what she might uncover if she pushed too far. The following days were a blur of numbness and routine. Isabel went to work at the publishing house, keeping her head down, but every time her phone buzzed or someone approached her desk, her heart would race. She hadn't told anyone about Dominic. There were no calls from the police, no mention of a body being found in the Thames. The world seemed to carry on as if nothing had happened. But Isabel couldn't carry on. The weight of Dominic's disappearance pressed on her chest, the unanswered questions gnawing at her. One night, unable to bear it any longer, she sat down in front of her laptop, determined to find some trace of what Dominic had been involved in. Her search began innocently enough, Googling his name, looking through old emails, messages, but nothing seemed unusual. He was a respected architect, his name tied to a few prominent projects in the city, but nothing sinister. No signs of trouble. Then, late into the night, she found something. It was an old email, buried deep in her inbox from months ago. At the time, it had seemed like spam. Some financial investment offer Dominic had forwarded to her with a casual, "Ignore this." But now, reading it again, her blood turned cold. The email was from an unfamiliar company, a shell corporation by the looks of it, promising high returns on a massive loan. And Dominic's name was all over it, along with her own. Isabel stared at the screen, her hands trembling again. Her name, her information had been tied to whatever deal Dominic had gotten himself into. That man's words came back to her, echoing in her mind. Dominic used certain assets, your name among others, to secure investments. Had Dominic been planning to use her as a scapegoat if things went wrong? Was he trying to protect her? Or had she been nothing more than a pawn in whatever scheme he had gotten wrapped up in? She felt sick. She had loved him, trusted him, and now she didn't even know if any of it had been real. The next morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just her name, scrawled in sharp black ink across the envelope. Isabel's hands shook as she opened it, pulling out the single sheet of paper inside. Stop asking questions. You won't like the answers. There was no signature, but the message was clear. Someone was watching her. Someone knew she was digging. For the first time in days, Isabel felt a surge of anger cut through the fear. She couldn't walk away, not now. Not after Dominic had left her tangled in this mess. She needed answers. She deserved answers. But where to start? Who could she trust? Isabel stared out of the window, watching as the clouds gathered again, thick and gray over the London skyline. The rain would come again soon. She was sure of it. The city, with all its secrets, was closing in around her. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. There was only one place she could go to start unraveling this mystery. Dominic's office. If there were any clues left behind, any hint of what had truly happened, they would be there. The architecture firm where Dominic had worked was housed in a sleek glass building in the heart of the city, a stark contrast to the chaos Isabel felt inside. She had been here many times before, meeting Dominic for lunch or waiting for him after work, but today it felt different, cold, unfamiliar. As she walked through the lobby, her steps echoing in the cavernous space, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She reached the lift and pressed the button for the top floor, her heart pounding in her chest. When the doors opened, she stepped into the empty hallway. Dominic's office was at the end, the door slightly ajar. Isabel pushed it open, her breath catching as she stepped inside. The office was exactly as she remembered it. Sleek, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. But something was off. Papers were scattered across the desk, drawers left half open, as if someone had been in a hurry to leave. She moved to the desk, rifling through the papers, her hands shaking. Most of it was architectural plans, contracts, nothing out of the ordinary. But then she found it, an envelope tucked underneath a stack of blueprints. It was unmarked, but inside was a small USB drive. Her fingers closed around it, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. This was it. Whatever Dominic had been hiding, whatever had led to his death, it was on this drive. But as she turned to leave, she heard a sound behind her. The door clicked shut. Isabel spun around, her heart racing, but no one was there. Just a soft click of the door locking. She wasn't alone anymore. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as the door clicked shut behind her. The office, once a familiar space, now felt suffocating and alien. She clutched the small USB drive in her hand, the cold plastic digging into her skin as she scanned the room. Her breath was shallow, and her pulse thudded in her ears. The silence was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air had thickened with tension. She could feel someone's presence. She wasn't imagining it. Slowly, she backed towards the desk, her eyes never leaving the door. Her mind raced. Had she walked into a trap? Was Dominic's involvement in something darker than she ever imagined? Just as her fingers grazed the edge of the desk, she saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. Her breath hitched, and then a voice broke the silence, low and smooth but with an unmistakable edge to it. "Isabel, I warned you. You should have left us alone." The voice belonged to the man from the bridge, the one who had come to her flat that night. He stepped out from behind one of the tall bookshelves that lined the back wall, his gray suit still immaculate despite the day's events. His eyes were sharp, piercing, and there was a calm menace in the way he stood, as though he already knew the outcome of this encounter. Isabel's grip tightened on the USB drive, her mind screaming at her to think quickly, to find a way out. She swallowed hard, trying to mask the fear tightening her throat. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer, his shoes making soft, deliberate sounds on the polished wood floor. "You found something you weren't supposed to," he said, eyeing the USB drive in her hand. "That drive contains information Dominic should never have kept. You see, he was involved in things far more complicated than you're capable of understanding." Isabel stood her ground, though every instinct screamed for her to run. "What kind of things? Why did he use my name?" The man chuckled softly, as if amused by her question. Dominic was a talented architect, but like many ambitious men, he bit off more than he could chew. When he couldn't repay certain debts, he got creative. Using your name as a safety net was part of that creativity. Isabel's stomach churned. She felt like she had been used, manipulated without even knowing it. All the love she'd felt for Dominic now seemed like a fogged memory, tainted by this horrifying reality. "So what now?" she asked, forcing herself to sound braver than she felt. "You've already taken Dominic from me. You think I'm just going to hand this over to you?" She lifted the USB drive slightly, her eyes narrowing. The man's expression darkened, his casual demeanor fading. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Isabel. Dominic's death was unfortunate, but it was a necessary outcome. You're a loose end now, and people like me don't leave loose ends." His words sent a bolt of ice through her. She glanced quickly at the window, trying to measure her options. She had to get out of here, somehow. The USB drive held the answers, but she needed time to figure out what to do with it. The man moved closer, his eyes locked onto hers, his expression cold and controlled. "Give me the drive, and maybe we can forget you ever found it." Isabel knew better than to believe him. There was no way she could trust someone who had been involved in Dominic's downfall. She needed to buy time, think of an escape. "I don't know what's on this drive," she said, holding it out slightly, teasing him with it. "But I know it's important. Important enough for you to threaten me over it." The man's jaw tightened, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I'm not going to ask you again." Before Isabel could respond, a noise outside the office caught both of their attention. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The man stiffened, his eyes flicking to the door, and in that split second of distraction, Isabel made her move. She grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the desk and hurled it at the man's head. He ducked instinctively, but the paperweight smashed into the bookshelf behind him with a loud crash. Taking advantage of his surprise, Isabel darted towards the window. The window was a large, floor-to-ceiling pane of glass, overlooking the streets below. Her heart raced as she fumbled with the latch, her fingers trembling. She could hear the man recovering behind her, his footsteps quick and deliberate as he approached. Just as she managed to slide the window open, a strong hand grabbed her shoulder, pulling her back roughly. She gasped, her body twisting as the man yanked her away from the window and slammed her against the wall. The force knocked the breath from her lungs, and she felt the USB drive slip from her fingers, falling to the floor with a clatter. The man's face was inches from hers now, his expression filled with cold fury. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." But just as he reached for the USB drive, the office door burst open. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway lights. For a moment, neither Isabel nor the man could see who it was. But then the figure stepped forward, and Isabel's eyes widened in shock. It was Dominic. He looked disheveled, his clothes wet from the rain, his face gaunt and pale, but alive. Very much alive. "What the hell are you doing here?" Dominic spat, his eyes flashing with anger as he looked at the man. This wasn't part of the plan. The man turned, momentarily stunned by Dominic's appearance. "You were supposed to be dead." Dominic's jaw clenched. "Yeah. Well, things didn't go the way you expected." In the chaos, Isabel saw her chance. She scrambled to the floor, grabbing the USB drive just as the two men squared off against each other. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed towards the open window, her eyes flicking between Dominic and the man, unsure of what to believe. Dominic's gaze met hers for a brief moment, and there was something in his eyes, something pleading. "Isabel, don't listen to him. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'm trying to fix it." But Isabel couldn't trust him. Not anymore. The man lunged towards Dominic, and in the confusion, Isabel did the only thing she could think of. She climbed out of the window, balancing precariously on the narrow ledge, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. The wind whipped around her, the city lights stretching out below. She heard shouts from inside the office, but she didn't look back. With her heart racing and her pulse thundering in her ears, she began inching her way along the ledge, knowing that if she fell, there would be no turning back. Isabel's heart raced as she clung to the narrow ledge, the chill of the wind biting at her exposed skin. The world below her was a blur of city lights, far too distant for comfort. She could hear the muffled sounds of Dominic and the other man shouting at each other inside the office, but her focus was on survival. One wrong move, and she would plummet to her death. She took a deep breath, willing her shaking hands to hold steady as she edged along the ledge, her back pressed against the cold glass of the building. Rain slicked the surface beneath her feet, making every step treacherous. She had no plan, no clear path to safety, only the knowledge that she had to get away before either of the men inside could catch her. As she moved, her mind raced just as fast as her heart. Dominic was alive. After everything, after his apparent suicide, he was still breathing and somehow tangled up in this mess. But his explanation hadn't been enough. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he had said. But what exactly had happened? And could she believe him? The USB drive felt heavy in her pocket, the key to answers she didn't fully understand. Whatever was on it had driven Dominic to fake his own death and push that mysterious man to violence. And now she was caught in the crossfire, unsure who to trust, if anyone. Suddenly, a loud crash came from inside the office. Glass shattered, and the sound reverberated down the side of the building. Isabel flinched, nearly losing her footing, her heart jumping into her throat. She froze, her back pressed hard against the building, praying neither man would look out and spot her on the ledge. Seconds passed. She heard more shouting, voices raised in anger and confusion, then silence. She held her breath, listening. A minute ticked by. The only sound now the soft patter of rain and the distant hum of traffic from far below. She began moving again, faster now, desperate to reach the end of the ledge, where she could climb down a nearby fire escape. Just as she neared the corner of the building, she heard the office windows slide open behind her. Isabel froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. Slowly, cautiously, she turned her head just enough to glance back. Dominic stood in the open window, his face pale, his eyes wide as he searched the ledge. His gaze found her almost immediately. "Isabel," he called out, his voice hoarse, urgent. "Wait! Don't go, please!" "Let me explain." She said nothing, her grip tightening on the ledge. The rain made it impossible to keep her footing steady, and she didn't trust herself to respond without slipping. "Just listen to me," Dominic pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I never wanted any of this to happen. That man, he's dangerous. I was trying to protect you. That's why I had to disappear. But I'm not your enemy, Isabel. I need your help. Help." Isabel spat, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "You used me, Dominic. You lied to me. You faked your death. And now you expect me to trust you." Dominic's face crumpled with guilt. I know. But I had no choice. Things went south faster than I could control. The people I got involved with, they're not just dangerous, they're untouchable. I'm in over my head. We both are." The rain pounded harder, the wind picking up, whipping through Isabel's hair. She could feel the weight of the USB drive in her pocket, pressing against her thigh like a burning reminder of all the unanswered questions. "What's on the drive?" she demanded, her voice barely audible over the wind. Dominic hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the window. "It's everything. The deals, the money laundering, the names, everyone involved. That's why they want it so badly. Why they're after you now." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Money laundering? Names? She had known Dominic had been in trouble, but this was bigger than she had ever imagined. "Who are they, Dominic? Who's behind all of this?" His eyes darted nervously, as though the very mention of these people might conjure them into existence. A consortium of investors, some of them in high places. They're powerful, Isabel, people you can't run from. But if we can expose them, we can take them down. "Expose them?" she echoed, incredulous. "You want me to risk my life for this?" Dominic's eyes locked onto hers, pleading. "We don't have a choice. You have the drive. That makes you a target, whether you want to be or not. The only way out is to fight back." Isabel shook her head, her mind spinning. This was insane. She had been a book editor, living a quiet life, and now she was tangled in a web of corruption and danger. How had it come to this? Behind Dominic, she saw movement in the shadows of the office. The other man, the one who had chased her earlier, was still there. He stepped into view, his eyes cold and fixed on her. "You're running out of time," Dominic warned, his voice low. "Please, Isabel, trust me. We can do this together." But Isabel wasn't sure she could trust anyone anymore. She looked at Dominic one last time, the man she had once loved, and then back at the fire escape a few feet away. Her decision had to be made now. With a surge of adrenaline, Isabel pushed off the ledge and leaped toward the fire escape. Her hands caught the railing just as her feet slipped on the wet metal. For a heart-stopping second, she dangled in the air, her grip faltering. But then she pulled herself up, scrambling onto the platform. Behind her, she heard Dominic shouting her name, his voice filled with frustration and fear. She didn't look back. Isabel climbed down the fire escape as fast as she could, her hands slipping on the rain-slicked bars. She reached the bottom and darted into the alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The city was alive around her, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded. She needed to get somewhere safe,